Hey, welcome to class. I'm going to give you a short lecture here today on reading and writing, because this is academic literacies, and we're going to talk about our first writing assignment and about why we're working on the theme we're working on, and what all this has to do with your academic literacies. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint that I've created. I like creating PowerPoints. It gives me a way to think about creating and writing in a new way, presenting new information. I'm not always great with fonts and colors and stuff like that. I just try to figure it out. I think I can create an interesting slide, but sometimes it gets a little weird to look at. So just go with me, follow PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is mostly there as a visual guide so that my voice isn't so damn boring. So here we go. To hear me click and try to find my space, and I'm going to move my face because I don't want to block off any part of my PowerPoint. And my PowerPoint's probably more interesting than me. So here we go. Why do we read? And why do we write? Now, those are pretty silly questions, right? I mean, you read because you read, and you write because somebody tells you to, or because you have to, or because you want to. But they're a little more complex than just because you have to. I think it's worth asking, what is the purposes behind reading, and what's the purposes behind writing? There are many ways that we could relate as human beings. Now, the truth of the matter is, we've probably always read and wrote in some way or another, even when it's just, you have a face, I look at your face and I read it. Or, I want to give you a face, so I create it, I write it. But why do we read? Why do we write? Well, I think it goes back to like our existential loneliness, our individuality, and we want to find a way to make connections with each other. And sometimes those connections need to be a little bit more formalized, particularly on paper or on a screen, so that we can be more clear about those connections. So we try to connect with each other through our reading. I connect with what you've written, you connect with what I've written. We connect with each other through our writing. I try to tell you something through what I want to say. You try to tell me something. This connection builds knowledge. When you understand me better and I understand you better, we build knowledges about the world we live in. And then when we expand our reading from just you and me to going out and reading the news or reading a novel or reading a road sign, when we expand our reading, we begin to understand broader, more people around us, more connections around us. We build knowledges of other people's experiences. These connections and these knowledges help us build meaning in this world. What matters to us individually, what matters to us about other people. We can build meaning that gives this life some substance. Because without meaning, we are just people who are ultimately alone, trying to figure out our way. So I want you to think a little bit about this formal act of reading. Who are you? And what do you do when you engage with the text? And what happens after that engagement? Here I'm going to use the text that we're going to be reading later this semester, The Beauty of Your Face by Sahar Mustafa. And I want to think about what it means that we encounter this text and it gives us meaning. You have you, just the basic you, your everyday feelings, your everyday senses, your everyday experiences. You have a text that is written about a Muslim teacher in a Muslim school who is experiencing her daily life. And through the combination of you and your encounter with this text, you build connection with the main character or maybe with the author herself. You build knowledges about this world that you're reading, about why it's, what happens there, and what are the experiences of others there, and from that connection and those meanings, you build, I'm sorry, that connection and those knowledges, you build meaning. It may be that your life experience is close to Sahar Mustafa's, that you are a Muslim woman yourself, or it may be that it is very far from it. You're just another white dude. And what happens though is, because you are encountering this text, you build connections and knowledges and meanings about a life that is not your own, even if you are very close to it or not. You build feelings and reactions. Doesn't mean that we're all going to love Sahar Mustafa after this, that we are going to become, this is going to be our new reality. It means that we can build something from our experience of this book through our reading of it. So take us to our writing. We talked about this writing in our class the other day, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail. I'll just remind you what the primary assignment is. The primary assignment is, you're going to take this reading experience we had in week 2, what it's like to be a college student during a pandemic, and you're going to select 2 of the stories from that reading. And in those 2 stories, you are going to think about, I just realized I got to move my face so you can see Cardi B. In those 2 stories, you're going to think about why they're meaning. You're going to build. I'm sorry, I got distracted by Cardi. With those 2 stories, you're going to read them, and you're going to build connections with those people in those stories. You're going to build knowledges of their experiences, and you're going to build meaning out of that reading. But you're also going to take your own story, your own experiences that you wrote about in week 2 discussion board that we talked about in our last class, or about some other pandemic learning experience, and you're going to read that as well. Build a connection to the meanings you have in that experience. Build knowledges about those meanings, and build those meanings. You take those 3 different experiences, and you develop a meaning about pandemic learning. So I'm just going to cover the major requirements. It's going to use 1 personal story and 2 stories from the reading. It must focus on education and the pandemic. It must develop and explore a specific meaning for your readers. It must show that you are thoughtfully engaged with your writing, and it must be at least 3 pages. Cardi has her own comment on that. So what does this look like? What does this mean? If we go back to that reading experience where it's Cookie Monster, the beauty of your face, and connection, meaning, and knowledge. What does it mean now that we are changing it and thinking about writing this paper? Well, you have your experience, and then you have the experience of 2 other students from that reading assignment we had. I'm going to call them Mona and Abe. You have your experience, Mona's experience, and Abe's experience. And you take those 3 experiences and you put it through a reading process. And it goes in one cone, it comes out the other. And that reading process allows you to build a connection to those different experiences, and maybe connect the 3 experiences together. It'll build knowledges about what it means to learn during a pandemic for different students, and from those connections you start to build meaning. That's the basic idea of this assignment. Now let's complicate it. Quite often, when we try to write for school, our writing is just contextualized within the class itself, like there's no other world happening around it. This often happens in a literature course where a teacher wants you to write about Romeo and Juliet, and you never really think about the world outside of that text. But the reality is, we don't go to school in isolation. We go to school in the world. And the world is happening around us, and we have seen that world happening in the past year in multitudes of ways, in multitudes of stressful ways, and I'm using these protest signs as a way to express that. So upper left, we have a student who says she doesn't want to text her mom, "I love you," from under her desk during a school shooting. In the middle of the screen at the top, we have women dressed for like characters from The Handmaid's Tale, a story about what happens if the U.S. goes back to a very religious, conservative space, or the Western culture goes back to that, and they're protesting so they have the right to control their own body. Over on the top right, we have people who are protesting about the election and their belief that the election was stolen from their little hero. Down in the lower left, we have a woman protesting, asking police to stop killing us, and using the very famous phrase now, "I can't breathe." Next to that one, there is a protest going on of students who want to be able to learn in school, not in their bedroom, protesting online education. The next, somebody protesting for the right to her own body, but I guess the only body that matters is the mask and the mouth. She is claiming it's her body, her choice. She shouldn't have to wear a mask. And then next to that, people protesting that we should be backing the blue. And I share all these different protests as a way of thinking about this world, this crazy world, this stressful world, this chaotic world that is happening around us, and how that affects our ways of making connections and knowledges and meanings. Because we can read these texts, not just the signs, but the people and the experiences. We can read them to build connections to these people. That's why protest is actually effective, because even if we can't stand the cause, we have to see the person behind it. We can build connections and we can build knowledges about those protests and those experiences, and from that, build meaning. Now, what happens to the reading process then when we complicate it with the world? Well, I'm going to do a mathematical equation like the first one here, and I'm not a math teacher, so who knows if this makes sense. But if we take you and the world and we multiply them together, and then on top of that we add a book that you're reading, you times the world plus the blind spot, the second book of our class, what we end up with is a more complex connection with others and ideas, a more complex set of knowledges that we can draw on, and ultimately a more complex meaning about the world, about the book, about ourselves. If we try to understand the book Blind Spot, which is about our biases that we have against each other and against concepts, and we combine that reading of the Blind Spot with our understanding of Black Lives Matter marches through the past summer, we build a more complex understanding, a more complex connection, knowledge, and meaning with the world and with this book. This takes us to the theme of the class. This class is going to focus on issues of race and identity, and in particular, how those issues build within us, a type of conflict with the world once we start to recognize them. I came up with this theme this past summer when the hubbub about critical race theory came about in our society. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to it, but a whole lot of people got really uptight in their britches about this idea of critical race theory. And it's, frankly, just to be honest and straightforward, there's a conservative boogeyman here, this critical race theory. They're worried about colleges and high schools and elementary schools, junior highs, teaching critical race theory to kids and brainwashing them. And that's the objective truth. Here's my opinion. It's complete hogwash. Critical race theory is a theory, and it's used within a particular field of study as a methodology. And here's what critical race theory is. It is the belief that we need to go back and think through our histories and our knowledges and think about issues of race. To pay attention to race throughout our history. And when we go back and pay attention to those things, that causes us to recast our understanding of what really happened. That's it. That's critical race theory. Some people are very scared of it. So scared, in fact, that they're creating laws to demand that you don't teach anything divisive in school. That's actually a law that's being debated right now in Ohio, that teachers can't teach things that divide people. It's a completely ridiculous idea. So I saw that this past summer, and I decided, well, you know what? Let's think about race. We're not doing necessarily critical race theory, and I'm not saying that because I'm afraid of somebody calling me out on it. Because critical race theory is a methodology, a way of thinking that is applied in specific places by specific people. But we are going to think critically about race and about identity, and think about, why do these things matter in our experiences, and in particular in this world right now, in this nation right now. Issues of race and identity are highly in flux. You think about the immigration debates of the past few years. You think about the Black Lives Matter shooting, Black Lives Matter protests, and the shooting of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and you think about the abortion bans in Texas, and what we find over and over and over are issues of race and identity. They're important in our nation. They're important in our state. And particularly, they're important at our school. And if you look at the faces on the screen when we have class, ideally someday you look at the faces as you walk down the hallway, you will find that we are a school that is really must be focused on issues of race and identity. So we're using this, we're thinking about this in our class, and we're applying issues of race and identity in our reading, in our writing, as a way to make things meaningful. So I've asked you in your first writing assignment to not just think about your experience and Mona's experience and Abe's experience and build connection and meaning and knowledge, but instead also maybe to think along terms of race and identity as a text. And put that in your reading process as part of the mix. And from that, build a more complex connection, meaning, and knowledge. What happens when you think about your experience and Mona's experience and Abe's experience, and then you also think about, how has the pandemic affected students of color in school? How has the pandemic affected our ability to build an understanding of gender in the classroom? How has the pandemic affected people of a different economic class? It's been a struggle for people of a certain economic class. There are many ways to think about race and identity, and what I'm asking is you just to focus a little bit on one of those ways, combining it with your experience and Mona's experience and Abe's experience to engage in a reading process that allows you to build more complex connections, meanings, and knowledges. It's a lot, right? There's a lot of stuff there. That's why theory is kind of scary, and thinking about larger issues is kind of scary, because it forces us to ask questions that it'd be so much easier just to say, okay, I'm going to tell you Abe's story and Mona's story and my story, and then write in the conclusion of my paper, and done. But when you start to complicate it through thinking, through really careful reading, it becomes more. I don't want you to get overwhelmed here, though. I want you just to produce something for this class, and I want you to produce something meaningful, ideally meaningful for yourself first, and then meaningful for others. So here are main goals for writing number 1 to focus on. The first one, show engagement. Show me that you care about this. Show me that you're engaged. Number 2, develop some ideas. Don't just try to write randomly and just to meet the goals of the assignment, but develop some ideas that are meaningful to you and perhaps meaningful to others. Number 3, practice writing through reading. So that's what we're trying to do here is see the connections between our reading and our writing. And so you've done some reading here, practice writing through that to see what happens. And number 4, have something to say. Don't just write a paper, but write a paper to say something. Figure out what that is. And you figure out what that is through your reading practice. And ideally, what you end up doing is creating a text for me, where I become Cookie Monster and I'm picking up your text and I'm building connection and knowledge and meaning to you. Or you're building a text for your classmates, or maybe the world, where we can all pick up your text and understand a little bit more about your experience, Mona's experience, and Abe's experience, and we can build connections about with those experiences, and we can build knowledges about how those experiences are similar or different to ours, and from that we can start to build more meaning. There's a lot there, but ultimately you're writing a paper here for a class, and it's an entirely doable paper. Okay, I want to stop that for a second and come back and just mention that tomorrow is September 11th. And I think it's just irresponsible. Maybe not irresponsible, but I don't think it's good for me as a person not to mention that as I'm ending this video and ask you to think about it a little bit. And I don't want you to think about it so that you can get angry at those terrorists or angry at the world. I want you to think about it just as a human experience. It was a very human experience for most of us that were around at that time. I think everybody that was around. We all had feelings. I've been listening to a couple of stories on the radio about it, and I've teared up a number of times listening to those stories because it's 20 years ago, but it's still powerful. Think about the humanity of that experience. Reflect on it. Pray on it if you need to, or meditate on it, and think about how we are still moving forward as a humanity. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you have some time to relax, some time to appreciate life, some time to do some reading, and some time to do some writing. And we'll see you next week.